Thank you all for coming today. You are the hope of Greece and starting it anew. Let me also give you a very personal thanks for your willingness to listen to me in English. I travel around the world a lot, and it's often embarrassing. I'm the only unilingual person in the room. So I really appreciate this. You know, that title may surprise you. Talking about a Greek economic tiger in these circumstances may seem a little bit odd, but I'm going to describe a policy path you're all aware of, but a policy path, the tremendous results of which may surprise you. A policy path that leads to astonishing growth and prosperity, the virtual disappearance of involuntary unemployment and the most desperate level of poverty. All this may seem too good to be true, except it's been done in any number of nations around the world, from the Asian tiger to the Irish Celtic tiger. And this is the potential future of Greece as a prosperous, full-employed nation. When I arrive here in Athens, I am absolutely astonished by the work ethic of the people, by the general ethics of the population and the businesses, at least in the private sector, of efficiency in the private sector. And I'm astonished everywhere in the world, except Greece, about the talents and drive of Greek entrepreneurs. And that may tell you something about the current policy mix here, that almost everywhere Greek entrepreneurs produce amazing wealth and prosperity, except in Greece. And that means the entrepreneurial spirit here, along with the work ethic, actually readies Greece for a huge economic takeoff, an unbelievable economic takeoff. All that is required is not miracle policies, not superhuman effort. All that is required is to get the obstacles to growth and job creation out of the way. Let me very much thank Liberty Forum. Liberty Forum is doing incredible work in bringing the ideas that can take Greece out of its economic slump to the people. An Atlas network, one of the most powerful forces for good around the world. And I say that sincerely, for good, because they are promoting economic policies that do reduce poverty, that do create employment, that do create economic growth. My task is to introduce economic freedom. I'll be using the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom Index, which has been described by Nobel laureate Douglas North as the best available descriptions of free markets. So when you see the score in economic freedom, you actually pretty much see the score of a country in free markets. It is important to clear up some misconceptions that apparently are held by a large part of the population. Greece is not a free market economy. Greece has not tried neoliberalism. When you see the chart showing Greece's score, you'll see it's way down at the bottom of free markets. Greece's weak growth and the depth and length of the crisis are due to a lack of free markets, not some magical neoliberal reform, which actually never happened. Now, this is the economic freedom rank. I've chosen 3 examples. Switzerland, which has always had a high level of economic freedom, typically 3rd or 4th in the world, the highest except for a couple Asian nations. Ireland, which was around 20th, and then did a period of astonishing reform that lifted it into the top 10 and often into the top half of the top 10. Now, let's look at how Greece compares to these two European examples. Let's look at whether Greece has actually tried free markets and neoliberalism. A dive under both of the old parties to now 91st in the world in free markets. And by the way, you'll notice that it flattened out here, but that the current dive started before the 2007-2008 crisis. Greece was already on a downward path. Now, so you've seen what happens there, and you've noticed where Switzerland, Ireland, and Greece are. Let's look at GDP growth. Let's see how that compares. So, well, not really much for Greece. A little bit. It's had an upward twin. Of course, it fell badly during the recession. Switzerland has always been at the top, always great growth. Now, remember I mentioned the Irish reforms, the thing that caused Ireland to become called the Celtic Tiger. Look what happens to Ireland GDP after the reforms. That's not unique to Ireland. I'll show you other examples. It's like a rocket liftoff with some fairly simple, straightforward reforms. But you know, oh, and by the way, if you look at you'll see that in early years, 1970, which is as far back as we have measurement of economic freedom, Greece actually wasn't doing too badly. So it's fair to say that Greece was probably fairly good in economic freedom in the 1960s. And you notice that in the 1960s, Greece had strong growth. The secret is to recapture that. But you know, people are going to say, well, free markets are fine, but they're fine only for the rich. So let's take a look at the income share held by the poorest 10%. That's not very good. I mean, you know, some of your friends might say, well, look, there's a big fall during the recession that proves how evil free markets are. But take a look at Switzerland, one of the most free market economies in the world. The poorest 10% have a much higher share of national income. And in Ireland, which moved to free markets, I'm sorry, that was Ireland, this is Switzerland, but the story is the same. In the supposed neoliberal, anti-poor free market economies, the poor actually have a higher share of national income than in the supposed, than in Greece. And let's look at what's happened to unemployment. As Ireland went, Swiss unemployment, top of the peak in free markets, always extremely low. As Ireland moved to increase free markets, its unemployment falls like a stone. Now, yes, it did move up during the recession, not nearly as much as Greece, and it has fallen considerably. I'll show you some up-to-date figures later. Youth unemployment. Again, Switzerland, virtually non-existent. That's 7%. That's probably mostly people shifting jobs or between jobs. Ireland falls to virtually zero involuntary unemployment. Now, it does peak up, not nearly as bad as Greece with its non-free market economy, and it starts to recover quickly. These figures are only for 2014. So this is the most recent data. The free market economy of Ireland, while it suffered seriously during the crisis, has rebounded hugely due to free market policies. Total unemployment in Ireland is now about 7%. In other words, about a third of what it is in Greece. Just a few years after the recession, the recovery is powerful. Youth unemployment, about 15% compared to 45% in Greece, about a third. Current rates of growth, Ireland at 4%, about 3 times the Greek recovery, which is finally beginning to happen. So this is what free market policies can do. Lead to growth, lead to huge employment growth, and as we'll see later on, really cut overall poverty. Just another example of the myth that Greece has tried, neoliberalism. This is the ranking of Greece in the World Competitiveness Forum. 81st, that doesn't represent a free market. So again, I think there's huge possibility here. All the traits are in place for a profound takeoff, particularly with Greek entrepreneurship. Now, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but I'm going to level a little bit of criticism at the EU. The EU, in my opinion, was far too anxious to see French and German banks repaid, and not nearly anxious enough to undertake the fundamental structural reforms that could unleash this growth. So some of the things the EU is asking for are good and will help, but their focus has been, in my view, muddled. And this is where you come in and take over and grab hold of the reform process. Because the reform process can easily get derailed. It did in the early 2000s in the Arab world, which led to the Arab Spring, economic frustration more than a demand for democracy. You need a government that is sincerely committed to reforms. If it's just being pushed into reform, the reform will not be carried out well. There will be cheating on the reform, and the structural changes that are necessary will not happen. You also need strong institutions or a willingness to reform them, as happened in Georgia. The most important thing, and this is one of the key challenges to people in this room, is to help the folks of Greece understand the need for reform, understand that lack of reform is the cause of their problems, and the huge potential that can be unleashed if Greece moves to economic freedom and free markets. I'm going to very quickly describe the Economic Freedom Index. We now measure most of the world's population. We only use third-party data, in other words, data that we don't produce. That's important because it means that our subjective views do not influence the outcome of the index. So it's not us saying Greece is 91st in the world in economic freedom or 91st in the world in free markets. It's objective data from third-party sources that we do not influence. This is a classic definition of economic freedom. Individuals have economic freedom when the property they acquire without the use of force, fraud, or theft is protected from physical invasions by others, and they are free to use, exchange, or give their property so long as their actions do not violate the identical rights of others. That is a long and complicated sentence. And what it means is individuals and families have the ability to make their own economic decision, free of obstacles put in their place either by overweening government or greedy crony capitalists. We look at 5 areas: size of government and taxation. If government taxes away too much of your property, it limits your economic freedom. If government spends too much, regardless of where it gets the money, it reduces the space for free exchange. Private property and the rule of law. This is the fundamental infrastructure of economic freedom. If your property isn't protected, if your property isn't protected, you can't have economic freedom. If the rule of law is not in place, the rich and the powerful, the cartels and the greedy crony capitalists will reduce the economic freedom of the poor and the weak, and this has happened in Greece, will reduce the economic freedom of the poor and the weak to the advantage of the rich and powerful. The rule of law is essential to provide economic freedom for all. Sound money, government can expropriate your property every bit as easily through inflation as it can through taxation. Trade regulations and tariffs. A small economy like Greece needs to be open to the world. You need the world as your marketplace. Regulation of business, labor, and credit. You should be able to start a business when you wish, close it when you wish. Hire whom you wish, work for whom you wish. Borrow from whom you wish, lend to whom you wish. The Economic Freedom of the World Project has made a huge difference globally. We now have members of the Economic Freedom of the World Network in nearly 100 nations and territories. I'll give you a second to read that. Everyone got it? Good. Because economic freedom has shown such benefits for people, it has continually grown over the past decades. It fell back a little bit during the Great Recession, but it is now growing again, bringing huge benefits to people. Why is economic freedom important? Without economic freedom, you get ahead by actually making other people worse off, by restricting markets, by creating cartels, by limiting choice so that people can only buy inferior goods and services at whatever price whoever has the power decides. You get ahead by making people worse off. With economic freedom, with free entry, with choice, you only get ahead by making people better off, by producing goods and services that people want to buy voluntarily, and they want to buy it voluntarily because it will make them better off. That's a huge change in societal dynamics, from getting ahead by making people worse off to getting ahead by making people better off. It leads to a society with higher levels of trust and a greater civil society, but it also unleashes something else. If there's free entry and free choice, if you're a producer, you have to continually improve your product. You have to continually innovate. You have to continually find ways to improve quality and ways to lower price. And that sets off the dynamic that creates the huge wealth of truly free economies. I'm going to look at the impact on prosperity and development. The most economically free nations are represented by the pillar to your left, the least free quarter by the pillar to your right. The average per capita income in the most economically free nations is $39,000 a year. By the way, this is purchasing power parity adjusted. And the average per capita income in non-economically free nations is only about $6,000 a year. But again, people say, well, that's fine, but it's only the rich that benefit. That is completely false. This is the income share of the poorest 10%. This is not one of my favorite slides, but because it shows it's kind of a random walk. In an uneconomically free nation, the poor get about the same percentage of national income that they get in the most free nations. And in some uneconomically free nations like Greece, it's even lower than that. But here's the miracle. Economic freedom may not do much to reduce inequality, but economic freedom virtually eliminates the most desperate poverty. Because economic freedom produces such higher levels of prosperity, the same share of national income means that the poor in the least free nations have an average purchasing power parity income adjusted of about $9,000 a year compared to just $1,000 a year. So desperate poverty is virtually eliminated. Economic freedom and governance. Economically free nations are much more likely to be democracies because they reduce dependence on government and crony elites. Much more likely to have high levels of other freedoms. Other indicators of well-being. Economic freedom is a medicine that cures corruption. Without economic freedom, if you need to ask somebody's permission to do something, there's always someone to pay off. If you're economically free and you can do it without asking somebody's permission, there's no one to pay off. Corruption withers. Economic freedom and life satisfaction. Now, this is one of my favorite charts. You know, the left, those who oppose economic freedom, gave up a while ago on the prosperity argument. They'd say, well, yeah, maybe free markets produce higher levels of prosperity, but it's really happiness that matters. And who could be happy in a dog-eat-dog capitalist world? Well, as it turns out, and there's a huge amount of research on this now, not just this quartile chart, article after article after article in academic magazines that show economic freedom is actually a cause of happiness. People like being able to control their own lives and fate. People like to be free. Who knew? When you have control of your life and you make your own choices, that will increase life satisfaction. Not when a leftist government or crony capitalists make those choices for you and you feel helpless. Life expectancy at birth. This is another chart I like. I grew up in Canada, an economically free nation. I'm about this age right now, which would be my life expectancy in a non-economically free country. So I'm glad I was born into one of the most economically free countries in the world. Literacy improves. You get ahead not by whom you know, not by your contacts, but by your ability to produce goods and services and be productive. That puts a premium on the individual and education. Literacy rates dramatically improve in economically free countries. And the gap between boys and girls, men and women, begin to shrink. By the way, just let me address another myth here. People say, well, you know, you're talking about developed nations when you talk about economically free nations, nations that have always been rich. That's not the case. Ireland was one of the poorest nations in Europe, far poorer than Greece, until it moved to economic freedom. South Korea and Taiwan both lived under brutal military dictatorships in an aftermath of wars that had devastated them. These countries went from poverty and low education levels to huge wealth with economic freedom. Nations like Argentina went in the other direction. And Greece, sadly, has been going in the other direction. I'm going to wrap up now. I just want to show you some other success stories, just like Ireland. Asia. The Southeast Asia Economic Freedom Score, kind of middling along. a little bit better than, well, obviously a lot better than Greece, but not huge. Korea went up and became solidly in the upper middle part of economic freedom. Singapore, an isolated little spit of land with no resources and no prospects. In fact, the Prime Minister of Singapore, when Malaysia said, "We don't want you," Singapore is going to have to become its own independent country because Malaysia is not going to absorb Singapore. Prime Minister Lee, believe it or not, actually shut himself in his bedroom for a week. He was so depressed, held press conferences in his bedroom. But he took Singapore, despite its no prospects, to the second highest level of economic freedom in the world. And this is what happened. Southeast Asia, little bit of growth. Korea, a success story, strong growth. But look at what happened to that little spit of land with no prospects. That looks like Ireland after it moved to economic freedom, and Greece could look like that too. Sub-Saharan Africa, Botswana became the most economically free nation in Sub-Saharan Africa. So this isn't just an Asian story, and it's not just a European story. It's also an African story. Sub-Saharan Africa, probably the lowest level of economic freedom in the world. Not even growth there. But look what happened to the most economically free nation in Africa. Took off like a rocket, like Singapore, like Ireland. Now you can say, wow, Botswana had lots of natural resources in the way of diamonds, but many African countries have a lot of natural resources, and only Botswana, with its high level of economic freedom, achieved that sort of growth and prosperity. Zambia, same sort of pattern. You'll see it takes off after it moves to a higher level of economic freedom. Well, I'm going to stop here. I've already gone on too long, so I'm not going to go through the individual slides of how Greece is doing. You all have that in your booklet, and I want to stop talking so you can get to work and develop ways and policies that fit the Greek situation, that will enable the Greek people to experience the type of prosperity and growth, the type of collapsing unemployment, the disappearance of the most desperate sort of policy that other free market nations have experienced, and find ways to communicate this terrific opportunity to the people of Greece. Thank you so much.